Thank you so much, Emily. Thanks to the PancakesCon board for letting me speak today. I've caught a few of the talks this morning, and they've set a very high bar. So I'm hoping to get close to it, but we'll do our best. My name's John, and I'm talking about leaky buckets. That's going to include talking about cloud storage buckets and just an introduction to how data can be publicly leaked from those. And then the second half of the talk is going to be about hydroponic buckets that you can use to grow tomatoes and other kinds of fruit. So hopefully you, the audience, are maybe interested in data leaks from cloud storage buckets, or maybe you're interested in growing tomatoes hydroponically. If you're interested in both those things, you've definitely come to the right place. And I guess if you want to see how many times I can say the word bucket, I think we're up to about 4 now, but feel free to count along there. This is a popcorn bucket representing you, the audience. This is me. Like I said, my name is John Askew. You can find me on Mastodon, GitHub, a bunch of other places with that same handle. I do offensive security stuff like pen testing, red teaming, a little bit of vulnerability research. Not an expert in cloud storage and not an expert in hydroponics, but I could not resist the juxtaposition of those two types of buckets. This is me social engineering my way into an office building in an inflatable Pikachu costume. Not entirely true. I'm not really a good social engineer, but I think it still counts because I didn't get challenged on the way in. So I'll take it. With all that being said, let's have some buckets of fun. So buckets in the cloud. We're talking about cloud storage and some common cloud storage providers are Amazon, Google, Microsoft Azure, plenty of other things as well. What do we mean when we talk about cloud storage buckets? Well, this is in cloud service parlance, this is infrastructure as a service. So this is like a low-level building block that you would use in other applications and in chaining different applications and services together for file type storage. We'll talk about these objects or blobs, which are basically files that are stored for applications, not necessarily end users directly. This is a type of storage that's going to involve APIs, API calls, and that sort of thing. Some examples, like I said, Amazon's S3 simple storage service, which was really the first one of these that was introduced, but pretty much every cloud service has something like this now. And it's one of the most widely used types of services because it's been around so long, and all the other services tend to use this for unstructured data. This is not an application that you would use for file storage or backup like Dropbox or Google Drive. There's a little bit of a difference there, though you could build that type of an application on top of a cloud storage bucket system. It's kind of like a cloud file system, but I want to draw some distinctions between other file systems. If you thinking about files on your local workstation, like Windows NTFS file system, or files on an internal server that you have, the data would transfer up to the cloud if you're copying a file up there, but file system permissions and other types of metadata would not be carried over. Also, something interesting about cloud file systems, while if you're looking in the web interface or other types of interfaces, looking at a cloud storage bucket, while it appears that there's folders and hierarchy, it actually doesn't exist. It's just a UI mechanism. There's actually no true folders in a cloud file system or a cloud storage bucket. All those paths are just keys. They may or may not have slashes in them somewhere. And that has some ramifications about how you do permissions on these things and whether or not you can do hierarchical permissions on a directory that trickle down into objects inside of that directory. We're talking about cybersecurity. So what are some risks around using cloud storage buckets? Um, well, we're going to talk about one specific risk today in our time here. We're going to talk about the risk of making data public in a storage bucket that maybe shouldn't be public. And there's a couple factors here. You have to keep in mind that cloud APIs are generally accessible to anybody on the internet. There's not necessarily any kind of network perimeter like there would be in a private organization with a private data center, whereas if you have misconfigurations in something, there still may be some other limiting factors as to having to be on the network to access such data. There's also, like with any type of data, no way for a system to tell whether or not data should be public or private without some context that a business owner or somebody who owns the data has to provide. We'll also see it's pretty easy to make misconfigurations that can make data public when it should be private. We see a lot of times people are trying to make a system work, make some business function work, and change access, change configuration to make it work. It's often easier to make the permissions wider than they necessarily need to be for that business process to work. And so exposures can go overlooked if the business is functioning normally, even if there's something that's accessible that shouldn't be, if you're not monitoring for those specific types of things. So how can some of this go wrong? We'll talk about a few data breaches that I've pulled up from recent years that involved storage containers that were publicly accessible. I know many of you have probably seen this type of thing because it happens all the time, but we'll just talk through a few of them to give some examples. So, and I don't do this to single any particular company or person out because this happens all over the place. These are just a few examples that came up in the news. So this first one, it's pretty recent, happened in January, or at least it was identified in January. There was an Azure storage container that was publicly accessible, misconfigured. It had a good 300,000 documents dated from 2016 and more recently. And it included customer details like addresses, contact information, as well as order details like home information, even home photos, internal and external. When it was identified, it was closed relatively quickly. And that's just a kind of a typical example of something that happens on a regular basis. Now, this data breach may not seem all that serious, but it pales in comparison to the next one. Pales is another name for a bucket. So this is one they gave a name to, Blue Bleed. This was discovered back in September. Azure Storage Container, again, was publicly accessible. This one was managed by Microsoft, though, I believe. It contained business-to-business information and included PII, personally identifiable information, other business data like statements of work and project documentation from a large number of entities. Again, when this was discovered and reported, it was reconfigured relatively quickly to no longer be public. And that's interesting because we see a lot of times these exposures are identified and then fixed quickly, but it's a little bit harder to go back in time and determine how long something's been exposed and which items may have been publicly accessed or leaked. So something to kind of think about. We'll put up one more here to give a Amazon S3 example. This was from May of 2020. It's an organization that attempts to connect student athletes with colleges and universities. There were a large number of student records, including minors' PII, as well as their parents' PII, test scores, a lot of other recruitment data, including pictures and video. This one was actually not fixed when it was reported. It was claimed that the data was meant to be openly available, even though nobody appeared to actually believe that had submitted the information. And I had to go and look around a little bit when I was preparing for this talk. I'm not aware of any companies that have ever shut down due to a cloud storage breach, which is unfortunate. One, because I feel like the companies that are irresponsible with data or make a mistake should have consequences that are at least as significant as the people whose data they were trusted with, but also because I was hoping that I could say that a company kicked the bucket. So, how do we identify these types of leaks and hopefully resolve them before somebody else finds them? Let's do a quick hop over to some cloud services here. So I've got a account here in Amazon. I've got a S3 bucket that I've set up called PancakesCon for fun, and I had to make this bucket publicly accessible. How do you do that today if you're creating a new bucket? And you'll see here Amazon likes to highlight, tries to make it pretty clear that it's publicly accessible when you do this. But there's to make it to where it's publicly accessible, I had to do a couple things. First, if you go to the permissions tab, we've got a section block public access. And then we've got another section bucket policy. And then finally down here, we've got an access control list. Now, this access control list is maybe a more of a legacy thing. By default, they disable this now when you create a new bucket, but things that are older may have these enabled. So you may also have to look here, or even some other types of controls that pre-exist to that. But for today, what I had to do was first go into bucket settings and uncheck this box. So this is kind of a safety valve or safety switch that ensures that all public access is blocked, even if you have other policies that say otherwise. This should be kind of a top level control. So I had to uncheck that. You can get a little more granular with it if you like, but I basically just removed that. And that still wasn't sufficient to make this data publicly available. So what I had to do then was create two statements here in the bucket policy. One is a statement that allows any principal, so any unauthenticated user from the internet, to get object. S3 get object is the action on our resource, which this represents our S3 bucket that we've created, and then /* means any object in that bucket. So this allows us to, as unauthenticated person, get any object from the bucket. But you still need to know the specific, the name of the object in order to retrieve it. So I added a second policy statement that gives anybody the list bucket permission on our bucket as a whole. And list bucket, it allows us to list all of the objects inside the bucket. So then we can come over here and build a URL which has our bucket name.s3.amazonaws.com. And if that listing is enabled, then we should get back some XML that contains contents, and it lists one key in here, hello.txt. And since we also are allowing get object, we can look up hello.txt and get a nice little message here. Hello, PancakesCon. So if we wanted to make sure that was no longer publicly accessible, the easiest way would be to come back up here and turn that off. Yeah, so now it may take a little bit of time to refresh, but that should disable the access. Similar thing you can do in Azure. We've got a storage account that we've set up, PancakesCon for fun. And then with, here, let me actually go back here. Yeah, here's our storage account, PancakesCon for fun. There's two pieces to this. The storage account, and then within the storage account, we've set up a container that's got the same name, PancakesCon for fun, and we've got one file in there. Now, in the storage container, we have this change access level that has three options. Private, which means no anonymous access. Blob means if you know the name of the blob, you can retrieve it. And container adds that as well as the ability to list all the blobs. So we've got it configured basically the same as our S3 bucket. And if we come over here and use the correct URL for Azure blob storage for listing, then that gives us this. And it includes a list of blobs, which we have one pancakes.jpg. And that means that we can then retrieve that blob. And you can see a picture of my breakfast from the pancake pantry, which now I'm a little bit hungry. Of course, this requires access to the respective accounts in order to list the bucket names and list the objects in the buckets. There are some ways that you can look for things without having full access. We'll just really briefly look at a tool called GoBuster. We can use GoBuster with the S3 command to provide a word list, which I guess I should show you what I've got in there. So I've got a couple words in here, PancakesCon and PancakesCon 4, and then I've also got some patterns that this tool will accept. So this will basically try every word list and then append the word fun to the end. So if we do and there we have, it's found our S3 public bucket, giving us the URL. So let's get back to our slides here. Kind of just quickly go over what we just did. The way to identify buckets that are public would be to get a list of those buckets, which is sometimes easier said than done. If you have access, then great. If not, you can try to search on the internet with some different tools. You can, maybe your organization is kind of decentralized. You've got different groups that are spinning up things that the other side of the organization is not aware of. So that not to trivialize that point, but it can be a little bit of a challenge. But you do need to know what those buckets are. Then you can easily use those URLs to check if the contents are listable. And if you can get a list of some objects in the bucket, then you can use the same URLs or APIs to check if the objects are readable. And I will put those URLs back up here. They're also in the Slack. At least the documentation is linked in the Slack for, here we have AWS S3. There's the list objects v2 for doing bucket listings. And then get object has a couple different ways to do it that are listed there in the access bucket intro documentation. We've got similar things for Azure that we just used. There's the URL that we use to list the blobs. You need to know the stored account name and the blob container name to do this. And then to get the blob there at the bottom, you also need to know the blob name. But those let you have a direct way of validating, which when I just did that, we were using a private or incognito browser session, so there were no sessions. I was able to just access those without any permissions. There's some tooling as well you can do if you don't have a full listing of public buckets or you want to go looking for some. This GoBuster tool we just used to search word lists and patterns for S3 bucket names. There's a lot of tools like this. There's also some web-based search tools like this Gray Hat Warfare site. Too many to probably list, but if folks have favorite tools that they use for this sort of thing, feel free to throw them in the chat for other people to have. So we talked about publicly exposed buckets as our threat model. There's a lot of other issues potentially with buckets as well that we don't have time to go through today. But thinking through some of these things, you can have permissions on individual objects, but not the bucket as a whole that may expose things. You may expose things by granting access to all authenticated users, which if pretty much anybody can go and get an Amazon account or an Azure account, then they can access those things. There's ways to indirectly expose buckets as well, and there are ways that access tokens and secrets can get leaked that can then lead to access on those storage accounts. One thing I do want to hammer home here is that when we're talking about looking back after a breach of this sort, too often there's not enough logging that was enabled. So you have a digital forensics incident response person come in. They're really going to want to have a log of read activities on those things, not just write activities, in order to be able to identify or verify that someone has or has not accessed that data while it was exposed. And then lastly, Microsoft has a good threat matrix, kind of a broader look at ways that cloud storage accounts can be abused by threat actors. And this lines up to the MITRE attack framework, if you're familiar with that, but it's all the different types of ways that an attacker might abuse a particular system. So with that, hopefully you can use some of this information to start the process of trying to find your leaks before someone else does. Breather. All right. So from here on out, I'm going to talk about buckets in your backyard. If growing your own tomatoes happens to be on your bucket list, this next part is for you. Not flowers, though, because that would be a bouquet list. So we're talking about hydroponics. Hydroponics basically just means growing plants without soil. So we're going to deliver the nutrients that they would normally get from soil via the water. And that's a pretty broad subject. We're going to narrow down to just a specific system called Dutch bucket hydroponics. This method involves a bucket filled with some inert grow medium and using drip irrigation and water recycling to supply that hydroponic nutrient. This is a fairly efficient method for growing heavier fruiting plants, in particular things like tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. And it's nice because it's used not just by hobbyists, but also by commercial growers. So there's some weight behind it as a serious method. Why did I get interested in Dutch bucket hydroponics? So like many of you maybe, I can always use a good hobby that gets me away from screens. But this in particular allows you to kind of nerd out as much as you want with monitoring and tweaking all the different parameters like the pH and temperature and times and all that stuff. So you can go as deep down the rabbit hole as you want, but you don't have to. There's a huge spectrum of how involved you can be there, which is cool. It also allows opportunities for engineering and creativity. Depending on your space and your materials and your budget, you can build different types of systems, bigger or smaller, that fit your needs. And you don't have to spend lots of money on a commercial system because a lot of this stuff can be built from PVC and buckets. You can raise some unusual crops that you might not find at the grocery if you want. And if you've never had produce that's straight off of the vine or straight from the garden, that's about the freshest that you can get. It's really hard to beat. Growing up, my grandparents had a big garden out in the country and grew all kinds of crops, but the tomatoes were always my favorite thing. They'd grow all throughout the summer, and just something about eating a tomato in the summer that really, really stuck with me. So I've really enjoyed being able to grow my own and kind of put a unique or a different spin on it. So if you want to grow tomatoes, there's a couple things you need to do, or other types of plants. Planting and propagation. The first thing is selecting the plants. Like I said, I like tomatoes. I also like bell peppers. There's lots of other things you can do. I'm actually going to try some cucamelons this year, hopefully, and maybe some ground cherries, which are things that I've never been able to find before at a store. If you're interested in herbs and greens, there's probably a better grow method like Kratky or nutrient film technique. And if you've got constrained space, there's probably some opportunities for using Dutch buckets, but you have to be conscious, particularly of the vertical space required. You can use some bush plants instead of some indeterminate vine plants if you don't have a lot of vertical space. And there's also other grow methods that work well in smaller spaces as well. But I think you can do a small scale Dutch bucket in a more constrained space. So you start with getting seeds. You can find seeds online at different stores. You can find them from a local community garden or gardening group, or get them from friends or relatives. Lots of opportunities there. You need to get some type of medium to propagate them in. I've used rock wool cubes here, but there's a lot of other options there. My grandmother just uses potting soil and keeps them indoors and puts them in the window and waters them. And so you can go all sorts of directions with this. The main factors for getting the seeds to germinate are water, temperature, and time. You want to make sure there's enough water. I've soaked these cubes in water to make sure they've got plenty of saturation, and I'll spray them every day or so. You want to get them warm enough. I think I've seen where 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit for tomato seeds. I shoot for about 75 because that's kind of the warmer places in my house can get around there. And then after about 4 days, these sprouted. I actually did these about 10 days ago, and this was how they started. And this is where they were after about a week. So they're doing great. I might actually be a little bit early this year because it's still cold outside. Indoor growing, I don't want to talk too much about, but if you're interested in growing indoors, you're going to have light expenses, electricity expenses. So if you can, make use of that free, wonderful sunlight, and consider your space. Although you might be able to control temperature and humidity a little bit better indoors rather than outdoors, especially here where it gets really hot in the summer. So the main thing I wanted to talk about was the system that I built a couple years ago for doing this. It started off looking like this. We've got some 10-foot planks on some cinder blocks. We've got a bunch of 5-gallon buckets. We've got a 2-inch PVC pipe that's about 10 feet long for the drain. And then we've got this reservoir that's basically a storage tub that I got at a hardware store. For the buckets, you could just use a standard 5-gallon bucket. You can go smaller, but 5-gallon buckets are so much easier to source. So that's what I would probably go with. A word of warning. So I got these actually at Firehouse Subs. They'll sell you used pickle buckets, or at least they used to, for like $3 or $4 with the lid. So that was a pretty good deal at the time. But don't buy a bunch of used pickle buckets during your vacation in the middle of a long drive, where you'll spend like 4 or 5 hours with your family complaining about how everything smells like pickles, and it's not good. But once you have them, clean them out, sterilize them a little bit. You'll drill a 1-inch hole in the side here, about 2 inches from the bottom. You get one of these 3/4-inch rubber grommets and fit it in there. Then you'll take PVC and a 3/4-inch PVC pipe and slide it through. That'll actually be the hardest part. You'll need to get it kind of wet and maybe a little soap on it to get it to squeeze through. But that'll be kind of your seal there, your water seal. And you'll have a right angle connector inside to keep the grow medium from going back into the drain. And then on the front side, you'll have another right angle that goes down into your 2-inch drain pipe. You'll need some grow medium to fill up your bucket. There's lots of options. You just want to make sure that they provide enough oxygen to the roots. I used perlite. It was easy enough to find. It held water and air pretty well. And I used a paint strainer there on the bucket to keep the perlite out of the drain. Then the reservoir. This is the main. This is a key component here. This holds the water. So you've got a centralized water system. Like I said, I used a 27-gallon HDX tub. You drill some holes for the irrigation pump to come out, and then for the larger drain pipe to come back in. You can kind of see there in the picture. When you're setting up the reservoir, you also want to think a little bit about temperature control. If you can put it somewhere where there's shade or where you can reflect light, that's going to help on the really hot days because you want that water to be cool enough. And you might even think about insulation. If you can like bury it partially in the ground where it's at, or put some platting around the sides or something. Stuff you might want to think about early on in the process. And it should be dripping water in there. So this is what it looks like after you've got the irrigation run. You can see the irrigation lines are coming in the top and then just stuck down in the grow medium next to the roots, and then the drain pipes are all coming out. You can also see I wrapped some panda foil around some of the buckets to try to reflect light off, and I did that to try to keep algae from growing too much in the buckets because the sunlight will still go in the sides of these buckets a little bit, and that's enough for algae to grow sometimes. Since then, I've actually painted them. I painted them black, and then I painted white over top of the black to reflect the light and keep them from getting too hot. We're going to see how that goes this grow season. And I've got to give credit where credit is due. I got the idea for this system from these places on the internet. This MHP Gardener is kind of the walks through most of what I just did. I've made some tweaks and things, but this was heavily used in the process. And then this other YouTuber, Hucho, I've used quite a bit of I've gotten quite a bit of information from his videos and postings as well. So those are some good places to go if you want more info on how to build that. Once you got it built, though, you got to care for the plants and you got to maintain the system, right? So there's a lot of steps to that too. First of all, the water. We've got to fill our reservoir up and add our nutrient. Then we're going to be periodically checking the pH and adjusting the pH. We're also going to be monitoring the temperature. You don't have to run this full time. I've generally set the irrigation pump on a timer that runs 4 times per day, about 15 to 30 minutes each time, maybe starting in the morning and doing the last one right after it gets dark. But a lot of these things are very, very forgiving. I don't know what the exact right number here is. I can just tell you what worked for me, but you can definitely experiment with a lot of this stuff and you'll probably still get decent results. It's a difference between good and great versus fail and succeed, I think, for a lot of stuff. You want to change that water out every couple weeks. I did not do that all the time, but I still managed to do okay with the fruit. But ideally, you're swapping that out every 1 to 2 weeks, adding new nutrient, readjusting the pH. I also have really hard water where I'm at, and I just went and used the city water, and it worked out okay. It's probably better to use less hard water, and a good option that's not super cheap or that's not super expensive would be a rain barrel, which I'm hoping to put one of those in at some point and use rainwater for watering the system. I wouldn't go with a reverse osmosis system. At least when I looked into it, it was going to be a little too expensive for what I was shooting for. But that may be an option for you. I don't know. Nutrients. This is what the plants eat to grow. This is another key part. I've had a lot of luck with just using this master blend tomato for everything. Just read their instructions. There's a 5-gallon recipe. So for 27 gallons, I just multiply that by 5. I mix up 60 grams of master blend and 30 grams of the Epsom salt in a 5-gallon bucket of water and stir that up real good. Then in a separate bucket, mix the 60 grams of calcium nitrate in a 5-gallon bucket of water. You don't want to mix the calcium nitrate in with others too early because it will mess it up a little bit. It's not dangerous. It just kind of ruins the formula. So what I do is I mix those both. Then I fill up the reservoir most of the way. Then I dump in the master blend mix, stir it in. Then I dump in the calcium nitrate and stir it in. I actually bought a 12.5-pound kit of this 3-pack from a company called Power Grow 2 years ago for like $32, and I'm still using it. It's a pretty good value if you're in North America. I think it's currently around $40. pH, you're going to want a pH, like a handheld pH tester, probably. It's important to monitor the pH for nutrient absorption. I would probably check it more frequently than you change the water, maybe twice a week, 2 or 3 times a week. I don't know. You can get as, like I said, detailed as you want. I would usually check it uh, midweek, and then again when I would refill the reservoir. Aim for around 6.0 pH. I definitely ran a little bit higher than that and still did all right. But that's a good target, I think, for the tomatoes. And then you can use food grade acid like the General Hydroponics pH down for lowering the pH. I never had a problem with it getting too low. It was always too high, so I only ever had to add acid. Temperature, this is the trickier part. When it gets real warm here, it would definitely, the water would get warmer than I wanted. So like I said, some cheap methods are shading and insulating the reservoir. Some people go out and build coolers, or they put it close to their house and try to do some fancy stuff there. I've had some success with just freezing water bottles and then tossing them in the morning or afternoon and then kind of cycling those in. But warm water is going to make it harder, make the nutrient absorption not as good, and you'll increase your risk of root rot, which is something that you want to avoid, that the roots get kind of brown and slimy. Getting pretty close on time, so I might not get through all these things, but a few other things tomato specific or vining plant specific. You'll probably want to do some pruning of your tomato plants as they grow. If you don't know what suckers are, they're like side shoots that come out of in between the main stem and one of the side branches, the leaf branches or the fruit branches. You can just pick those off with your finger as they come out if you catch them early enough. And that's what I try to do, because if not, they'll grow like completely new vines off the sides. And what I like to do is keep my tomato plants pretty clean and have a single vine going up to kind of maximize the fruit, and also make it easier to inspect the plant, and so it's because it's less crowded, and also allow better airflow and less humidity to reduce the risk of like fungus and things like that. You probably, if you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, then you're going to want some kind of trellising to keep the plants off the ground. There's a lot of different options of trellising, but I like using these spools of twine and tomato clips around the main stem. And that lets you, once they get tall enough, you can do this lower and lean method, which if you look up, it's about what it sounds like. You lower the vine down and then you shift it over a little bit so it goes up at a right angle. And then you can trim the lower branches off underneath the fruit. And so it can keep growing without, I'm not a tall man, so I like to keep it within a manageable altitude so I don't have to get a step ladder. Pests, real quick, remove these little guys, hornworms, with prejudice. As soon as you see them, they will wreck your tomato plants if given the chance. Also, watch out for things like blight, which, any kind of discoloration on the leaves or on the fruit. You'll probably want to go online and look that up to see what it looks like. Usually that happens with humidity. Depending on the season, it can be different things, early season or late season, but late season blight, at least, if you have humidity and the plants are kind of crowded, that can be a greater risk. And if that happens, it can kind of spread quickly. So you want to maybe move the affected plants away to avoid spread. Sometimes there's not as much you can do, though. So if you've got tips for that, I would love to know. Here's a picture of bucket bun chilling underneath the buckets. I can't get a good shot of them because if you go outside, they run away. So I had to zoom in with a phone camera. But everybody say hi to bucket bun. There's more fruit, and I may or may not have time for any questions. We're right about the mark, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Thanks, John. There are a few questions in Slack, and I will. I think it makes more sense to have them answered there rather than taking up more time. We got all the great links that you have already shared, and that was a super thorough overview on your techniques of growing some gorgeous tomatoes and also on securing online buckets. And with that, thank you.
All right, thank you. I will answer those questions in Slack.